When the fighting in Europe finally ended and the armies settled into occupation, Harry S. Truman inherited a problem he had never asked for and barely had time to understand. The war was over, Germany was defeated, and one of America's most famous generals was suddenly becoming a political liability. George S. Patton had won battles. No one disputed that. His dash across France, his relief of Bastogne, his relentless pressure on collapsing German forces had made him a symbol of American aggression and confidence. But as the smoke cleared and the task shifted from defeating Germany to governing it, Truman found himself reading reports that made him uneasy. Not because Patton was disloyal, but because Patton was speaking. Truman had only been president for weeks when Patton's name began appearing in briefings that had nothing to do with troop movements or supply shortages. Instead, they detailed interviews, remarks, offhand comments made in occupied Germany, comments about former Nazis, comments about denazification, comments about the Soviets. For Truman, this was unfamiliar terrain. As vice president, he had been kept largely in the dark about wartime strategy. As president, he was suddenly responsible for the political consequences of words spoken thousands of miles away by men whose reputations amplified everything they said. In private, Truman admitted to an aide that Patton confused him. "He's a hell of a fighter," Truman said, "but he doesn't know when to stop fighting." The occupation of Germany was not a continuation of the war. Truman understood that instinctively, even as he struggled to master the details. Germany needed order, legitimacy, and coordination among allies who already distrusted one another. Every decision had diplomatic weight. Patton did not speak diplomatically. Within weeks, Truman was receiving summaries of Patton's remarks comparing former Nazi Party members to political groups in the United States. The language alarmed State Department officials. British leaders expressed concern. Soviet media seized on the statements with enthusiasm. Truman read the reports carefully. He did not explode, but he was irritated. Behind closed doors, Truman asked a simple question. Who's running Germany? Us or our generals? The question revealed more than frustration. It revealed Truman's instinctive belief that civilian authority had to be absolute, especially after the war. The United States had fought to defeat dictatorship. Truman had no intention of allowing famous commanders to dictate post-war policy through press statements. Patton, however, seemed unaware of the shift. To him, Germany was still a battlefield, just one where the enemy wore civilian clothes and spoke cautiously. To Truman, Germany was a political minefield where missteps could trigger international crises. The difference in perspective mattered. In late summer 1945, Truman received a private memorandum summarizing Allied concerns about Patton's behavior. The tone was restrained but unmistakable. Patton's continued visibility in Germany was complicating relations with Britain and France and providing propaganda opportunities for the Soviet Union. Truman's reaction was blunt. "He's making trouble where we need quiet," he said. Unlike Eisenhower, Truman did not have years of personal experience managing Patton. He viewed the issue less as a personal dilemma and more as a matter of authority. In Truman's mind, generals executed policy. They did not create it. That distinction shaped everything he said about Patton during the occupation. Privately, Truman made it clear that he admired Patton's wartime record. He had no interest in tarnishing a war hero, but admiration did not translate into indulgence. If he wants to make policy, Truman reportedly said, he should run for office. Those words captured Truman's approach. Patton was not being judged for what he had done in war. He was being judged for what he was saying in peace. As reports continued to arrive, Truman's frustration grew. Patton's remarks were not isolated incidents. They reflected a consistent worldview, one that prioritized military clarity over political complexity. Truman understood complexity. He had risen through party politics, Senate negotiations, and wartime committees. He knew how fragile alliances were. He knew how quickly words could spiral into crises. In one private conversation, Truman remarked that Patton talks like the war never ended. That observation would become central to Truman's thinking. The occupation required discipline. It required coordination with allies who had their own domestic pressures. It required managing Soviet relations at a moment when mistrust was already hardening into rivalry. Patton's public candor cut across all of that. Truman began pressing his advisors for options. He asked whether Patton could be reined in, reassigned, or quietly removed from sensitive responsibilities. As Truman weighed those options, He became increasingly aware that the Patton problem was exposing something deeper than a single general's behavior. It was revealing how unprepared the United States was for the political consequences of victory. During the war, success had been measured in territory taken, armies destroyed, and timelines accelerated. In occupation, success was measured in restraint, legitimacy, and coherence. The metrics had changed, but not everyone had adjusted. Truman felt that change acutely. He had come into the presidency abruptly, without the gradual transition Roosevelt had once promised him, but never delivered. He was still absorbing briefings on intelligence networks, nuclear research, and post-war planning when the reports about Patton began piling up. Each one forced Truman to confront the same uncomfortable reality. The generals who had been given extraordinary freedom during wartime now needed boundaries, and those boundaries had to be enforced from the top. In one meeting with senior advisors, Truman listened as Patton's defenders argued that his bluntness was refreshing, that Germans responded better to clear authority than to abstract policy statements, and that Patton's warnings about the Soviet Union were proving increasingly accurate. Truman did not interrupt. When they finished, he responded with a question that cut through the argument. "Is he helping us govern Germany?" Truman asked, "or helping himself be heard?" No one answered immediately. That silence mattered. Truman was not offended by dissent. He had spent years in the Senate navigating disagreement, but he believed dissent had to occur within structures, not through headlines. Patton's approach bypassed those structures entirely. His reputation ensured that every comment carried disproportionate weight, regardless of intent. What troubled Truman most was not Patton's skepticism about denazification. Truman himself worried privately about the policy's scope and speed. Germany needed administrators, engineers, and managers to function. Removing everyone with a Nazi Party card was impractical. Truman understood that, but Patton did not raise these concerns through memoranda or internal channels. He raised them publicly, in language that sounded dismissive of the moral framework the Allies had spent years constructing. That distinction mattered enormously to Truman. In another private conversation, Truman remarked that Patton acts like the war gave him ownership of the peace. The comment was not cruel, it was analytical. Truman was identifying a mindset that he believed could not be allowed to take root. The occupation, Truman believed, had to demonstrate that military victory did not translate into political dominance by force of personality. Germany was watching, Europe was watching, and the Soviet Union was watching closely. Truman's advisors began to frame the issue more starkly. If Patton's conduct was tolerated, it would signal to other commanders that public freelancing was acceptable. If that happened, the administration would lose its ability to present a unified position abroad. That's how things unravel, one advisor warned. Not all at once, a little at a time. Truman agreed. He began keeping closer track of how Patton was discussed in diplomatic correspondence. British officials were becoming increasingly uneasy. France, still navigating its own political reckoning, worried that American messages about Germany were inconsistent. Even within the U.S. government, State Department officials complained that military voices were crowding out civilian guidance. Truman saw a pattern forming, and he did not like it. In his mind, the issue was no longer whether Patton was right or wrong about Germany's future. It was whether Patton was acting within the role assigned to him. Truman believed that once the war ended, that role had changed fundamentally. He expressed this belief bluntly in one closed-door meeting. "The uniform doesn't come with a microphone," Truman said. "Not anymore." That statement captured his evolving stance. The war had justified extraordinary latitude. Peace did not. Patton, however, showed little sign of recalibrating. He continued to speak forcefully, often framing his views as common sense being ignored by distant bureaucrats. To Patton, this was leadership. To Truman, it was insubordination cloaked in popularity. Truman's irritation deepened when intelligence briefings showed that Soviet outlets were selectively quoting Patton's remarks. The Soviets portrayed him as evidence that the United States intended to rehabilitate former Nazis and govern Germany irresponsibly. Whether fair or not, the narrative was gaining traction. Truman took this personally. He had spent his early presidency defending America's moral standing while navigating the first cracks in the wartime alliance. He was determined not to hand adversaries ammunition through careless rhetoric. In one private note, Truman wrote that Patton was undermining policy without meaning to. That phrase was important. Truman did not believe Patton was malicious. He believed Patton was incapable of operating within the constraints of peace. The president's frustration reached a turning point when advisors presented him with a consolidated report detailing how Patton's comments were being interpreted across Europe. The report did not exaggerate. It did not editorialize. It simply laid out reactions, headlines, and diplomatic responses. Truman read it twice, then he said, "This can't continue." From that moment on, Truman stopped asking whether Patton could be corrected and started asking how the administration could regain control of the narrative. He wanted a solution that preserved military honor while reasserting civilian authority. Reassignment became the most viable option. Truman discussed the matter carefully with Eisenhower, emphasizing that this was not about punishment, it was about alignment. The occupation required a different temperament, and Patton's was no longer compatible. Eisenhower did not argue. He had reached similar conclusions through his own experience managing Patton, but Truman's insistence sharpened the urgency. This was not merely a command issue, it was a presidential one. As Truman later told an aide, "If we don't draw the line now, we won't know where it is later." That belief guided his next steps. He made it clear that whatever action was taken needed to be decisive, quiet, and final. There would be no public rebuke, no spectacle. The goal was stability, not drama. Truman also made it clear that the decision would reflect on the presidency itself. He had inherited Roosevelt's global responsibilities, but not his personal authority. Establishing control mattered, both symbolically and practically. In Truman's view, the occupation of Germany was the first major test of America's post-war leadership. If that leadership appeared fragmented, the consequences would extend far beyond Europe. Patton, for all his accomplishments, had become a complication Truman could not afford. By the time Truman said that the situation was no longer tolerable, the decision was already forming. What remained was execution, and for Truman, execution meant restoring a single voice to American policy, one that spoke deliberately, cautiously, and with full awareness of the fragile world taking shape beyond the ruins of Germany. He made it clear that the status quo was unacceptable. "This isn't about medals," Truman said. "It's about control." The phrase was telling. For Truman, the issue was not Patton's beliefs. It was the precedent his behavior set. If one general could publicly shape policy through interviews, others might follow. And Truman had no intention of allowing the military to define post-war America's role in the world. Behind the scenes, Truman communicated his concerns to Eisenhower. The message was direct. Patton's comments were becoming a liability, and action was needed. Eisenhower understood. But Truman wanted clarity. He wanted assurance that civilian authority would be reasserted. As the occupation deepened and tensions with the Soviet Union grew, Truman's patience thinned. He began referring to Patton not as a hero, but as a problem, not publicly, privately. And in Truman's world, private assessments often became public decisions. What Truman said about Patton during the Germany occupation was not dramatic. It was not emotional. It was firm, practical, and rooted in a belief that the war had changed the rules. Patton had been essential to victory, but Truman was responsible for the peace. And as the months unfolded, Truman's words would help determine whether Patton still had a place in the world that followed Germany's defeat. As the occupation settled into its uneasy routine, Truman found that Patton's name continued to surface in briefings that were meant to focus on reconstruction, food shortages, and political stabilization. Instead, they returned again and again to the same problem. Patton's public remarks were complicating American policy at the very moment it needed discipline. Truman was not a man who enjoyed ambiguity. He preferred clear lines of authority and direct responsibility. The reports coming from Germany suggested neither. In one briefing, Truman was told that Patton's comments were being quoted verbatim in foreign newspapers, often stripped of context and amplified for political effect. British officials worried that Patton's rhetoric undermined Allied unity. French leaders, still grappling with collaboration and internal division, feared that American leniency toward former Nazis would destabilize their own governments. Truman listened, jaw set. "This is not what we fought for," he said quietly. Behind closed doors, Truman began articulating his position more forcefully. He told advisors that the occupation required one voice, and that voice had to come from civilian leadership. Generals were expected to follow policy, not freelance opinions. Patton's supporters argued that he was simply speaking truths others avoided. Truman was unmoved. "Truth doesn't excuse insubordination," he replied. That response reflected Truman's worldview. He respected the military deeply, but he believed just as deeply in civilian control. The United States had emerged from the war as a global power, and Truman was determined that it would not drift into a system where generals shaped policy through charisma or fame. In private notes, Truman referred to Patton as undisciplined in peace. The phrase was blunt, but it captured Truman's assessment precisely. Patton, meanwhile, continued to express frustration. He believed denazification was being applied too broadly. He worried that Germany's administrative class was being dismantled without replacements. He spoke openly about the Soviet threat and criticized what he saw as American hesitation. Truman did not dismiss these concerns outright. In fact, he shared some of them. He distrusted Stalin. He was already considering firmer policies toward the Soviet Union, but Truman believed that policy had to be deliberate, and Patton's approach was anything but. As autumn approached, Truman asked for a comprehensive assessment of Patton's role in Germany. The request was not framed as a personal inquiry. It was framed as a question of effectiveness. Is Patton helping or hindering the occupation? The answer, though diplomatically worded, was clear. Truman's reaction was swift. He told aides that Patton was out of step with the moment. He expressed concern that continued tolerance would embolden other commanders to speak out. "This isn't about one general," Truman said. "It's about who runs the country." That statement revealed Truman's deeper anxiety. He had inherited the presidency under extraordinary circumstances. He was determined to assert authority, not just abroad, but within his own government. Patton's behavior challenged that authority. In conversations with Eisenhower, Truman made his expectations unmistakable. Patton's remarks had to stop, or Patton had to be moved. Eisenhower, who knew Patton well, understood the gravity of the message. As reports of Patton's reassignment reached Truman, the president did not celebrate. He viewed the move not as punishment, but as correction. Privately, Truman expressed relief. What complicated the situation further was that Truman was still learning the full scope of what he had inherited. Roosevelt had managed personalities through instinct and longevity. Truman had no such cushion. He had been president only a matter of weeks when Patton's remarks began reverberating across Allied capitals, and every misstep now landed squarely on his desk. In private, Truman admitted that the speed of the transition unsettled him. One day he was approving troop redeployments. The next, he was refereeing disputes between generals, diplomats, and foreign governments, all while trying to define American leadership in a world suddenly without clear rules. Patton's comments struck Truman as especially dangerous because they bypassed the machinery Truman was trying to build. The State Department was drafting careful language. Military government officials were negotiating with local leaders. Allied commissions were hammering out compromises line by line. And then a single offhand remark from Patton could undo weeks of quiet coordination. To Truman, that was not candor. It was disruption. In one internal discussion, Truman asked whether Patton had been instructed to clear public statements through occupation authorities. When told that no such formal mechanism existed, Truman frowned. The answer confirmed what he already suspected. The post-war command structure had not yet caught up to post-war reality. "This is still running like a war," Truman said, "and it isn't one anymore." That realization sharpened his resolve. Truman was not interested in micromanaging generals, but he was deeply interested in establishing boundaries. The war had blurred them. Victory demanded hierarchy, speed, and autonomy. Peace demanded the opposite. Patton, however, seemed uninterested in boundaries. His frustration was genuine. He saw Germany's bureaucracy collapsing. He believed denazification risked removing anyone with administrative experience. He worried that the Soviets were consolidating influence while the West debated procedure. These were not irrational concerns. Truman recognized that. What troubled him was Patton's certainty that his conclusions justified unilateral commentary. Truman believed in debate, but only within the system. Outside it, debate became spectacle. And spectacle, Truman feared, would weaken American credibility at the exact moment it needed to be strongest. As the reports continued, Truman began to frame Patton's behavior in broader terms. He was no longer asking whether Patton was right or wrong. He was asking what Patton's behavior implied about civilian authority in the post-war world. The United States had just emerged from a war against regimes defined by militarized politics. Truman was acutely aware of that symbolism. Allowing famous generals to publicly challenge policy, even unintentionally, risked sending the wrong message both abroad and at home. In a private exchange with a senior advisor, Truman was blunt. "I didn't take this office to have policy set in press conferences." That sentiment would guide everything that followed. Truman also worried about precedent. Patton was not just any commander. He was one of the most recognizable military figures in the world. If Patton could speak freely, others might follow. And soon, Truman feared, the administration would be reacting to generals instead of directing them. That was unacceptable. By early autumn, Truman had moved beyond irritation. He was now thinking institutionally. He asked advisors to consider how other governments would react if American commanders appeared divided. He asked how Soviet negotiators might exploit perceived discord. He asked what message it sent to smaller nations watching the United States shape the post-war order. The answers reinforced his concern. In one briefing, a diplomat noted that Patton's remarks were already being cited in foreign parliaments as evidence that American policy was unstable. Truman listened carefully. "This is exactly what we cannot afford," he said. Behind closed doors, Truman's language hardened. He began referring to Patton as a problem that will not solve itself. He emphasized that admiration for Patton's wartime service could not override the needs of the present. "We don't run the future on reputations," Truman said. "We run it on decisions." The distinction mattered deeply to him. Truman had spent his political life working in systems, not spotlight. He believed institutions mattered more than personalities. And he believed the presidency demanded visible control, especially during moments of transition. As pressure mounted, Truman leaned more heavily on Eisenhower. He respected Eisenhower's judgment and understood that only Eisenhower could execute a solution without turning it into a public confrontation. Their conversations were direct. Truman did not demand punishment, he demanded order. Patton's remarks had to stop, or Patton had to be removed from positions where his voice carried political weight. Eisenhower understood exactly what Truman was asking. By the time formal reassignment plans were in motion, Truman had already internalized the lesson. The occupation of Germany was revealing a new kind of challenge, one that could not be met with force or charisma. It required discipline. It required silence at the right moments. And it required generals who understood that victory had changed their role. Patton, for all his brilliance, did not. When word reached Truman that Eisenhower had acted, the president did not gloat. He did not express anger. Instead, he allowed himself a rare moment of candor. "This should have happened sooner," he said, "not out of spite, out of necessity." The decision reaffirmed something Truman believed instinctively. The war had ended, but authority still mattered. And in peace, authority had to be unmistakably civilian. Only then could the United States move forward, not as an army in motion, but as a nation shaping the world that followed. And that conviction would soon be tested in ways Truman had barely begun to imagine. "We need fewer headlines and more results," he said. The effect was immediate. Allied communications improved. Diplomatic channels grew quieter. The occupation, while still difficult, became more manageable. Truman took note. In subsequent briefings, Patton's name appeared less frequently. When it did, it was in reference to administrative matters rather than public controversy. Truman never publicly criticized Patton. He understood the importance of preserving morale and honoring wartime service. But in private, his assessment was firm. Patton had been invaluable in war. In peace, he was a risk. That distinction guided everything Truman said about Patton during the occupation. He did not question Patton's courage. He did not question his patriotism. He questioned his judgment in a world where the battlefield had vanished. As Truman turned his attention toward rebuilding Europe and confronting the emerging Soviet challenge, he carried this lesson with him. The war had been won by generals like Patton. The peace would be secured by discipline, patience, and political control. And Truman was determined to make sure the line between the two remained clear.